Imagine that you're driving through the American heartland on a quiet Tuesday morning. The sun filters through your windshield as you pass endless fields of corn and wheat. Everything feels solid, permanent, unchanging. But beneath your wheels, something extraordinary is happening. Something that has been building for decades and is now reaching a critical point. America is quietly splitting apart. Not in the dramatic Hollywood way you might imagine, but something slower, more methodical, and in many ways more unsettling. Across the continental United States, from the Mississippi River Valley to the desert Southwest, the very ground we walk on is moving, cracking, and preparing for changes that could reshape the American landscape. You've probably never heard of the New Madrid seismic zone, yet it poses one of the greatest earthquake risks in North America. You might not know that massive fissures are opening in real time across Arizona and Utah, and while California gets attention for its San Andreas Fault, scientists are watching with growing concern as geological stress builds in places most Americans would never expect. Tonight, we're taking you on a journey beneath the surface of the familiar. We'll walk through small towns where the ground is literally giving way beneath people's homes. We'll visit research stations where seismologists monitor subtle tremors that hint at something much larger brewing. This isn't a story about disaster, though disasters may come. This is about the patient, persistent power of the earth itself and how the ground beneath our feet is never quite as solid as we assume. Sarah Martinez has lived in her ranch house outside Enoch, Utah for 23 years. She chose this spot for its peace, its wide views of red rock mesas. She never imagined waking up to find a crack running through her backyard. At first, it was just a hairline fracture in the soil, maybe 6 inches wide. Sarah thought it was the dry spell they'd been having, but this crack didn't close when the rains came. Instead, it grew wider. Within 6 months, the fissure had opened to nearly 3 feet across and seemed bottomless. Sarah could drop a stone into it and never hear it hit anything solid. What Sarah didn't know was that her backyard had become part of one of the most significant geological events happening in the American West. The Utah Geological Survey had been quietly documenting these earth fissures for years, watching as the ground literally pulls itself apart. Drive through rural communities scattered across Arizona's desert, and you'll find similar stories. Maria Gonzalez, who runs a horse ranch outside Phoenix, first noticed cracks appearing along her fence line in 2019. These weren't normal settling patterns. They ran in perfectly straight lines for miles, cutting across properties and continuing beyond the horizon. The horses sensed something wrong before the humans did. Maria noticed them avoiding certain pasture areas, stepping carefully around invisible boundaries that only became visible when hairline cracks appeared. Animals are often more sensitive to subtle ground changes than we are. For people living with these changes, daily life has developed a strange rhythm. Farmers check fields each morning for new cracks that might have appeared overnight. Property owners find themselves dealing with foundation issues as ground shifts beneath homes. Insurance companies are quietly taking notice, though most policies don't cover what's classified as earth movement. In Wilcox, Arizona, retired teacher Janet Chen has lived in the same house for 40 years. She remembers when the valley was dotted with farms and the water table was high enough that 20-foot wells hit water. Now, wells go down 300 feet or more, and the land itself is sinking in response to the missing water. Janet has watched her community adapt with quiet resilience. Neighbors help each other reinforce foundations. Local contractors have developed specialized techniques for dealing with shifting ground. The hardware store stocks concrete crack filler the way it once stocked fence posts. Life continues with matter-of-fact acceptance of the Earth's restlessness. Children play in backyards where mysterious cracks appear overnight. Families gather for barbecues on patios that might have settled several inches since last summer. There's an awareness that this is just the beginning. The cracks they're seeing are symptoms of changes that have been building for decades and will continue for decades more. To understand what's happening beneath America today, we need to travel back to a winter morning in 1811, when the Mississippi River ran backward and the ground shook so violently that church bells rang in Boston, 800 miles away. It was December 16th, and most of the central United States was still frontier territory. In the town of New Madrid, Missouri, population maybe 1,000 souls. People were beginning their daily routines when the first tremor hit. But this wasn't just any earthquake. This was the beginning of seismic events so powerful they changed river courses, created new lakes, and were felt as far as the Atlantic coast. Eliza Bryan was a young woman living in New Madrid at the time. Years later, she wrote detailed accounts of what it was like to live through months when the earth seemed to have gone mad. Her descriptions give us a window into the physical reality of living through major seismic events, and the psychological impact of having fundamental assumptions about stability suddenly shattered. The first earthquake hit at 2:15 in the morning. Eliza described being thrown from her bed as the log cabin began shaking so violently she could barely stand. Outside, she heard trees crashing and animals crying in distress. Most unsettling was the sound of the earth itself, a deep, rumbling groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. What Eliza and her neighbors didn't know was that they were experiencing the release of tectonic stress that had been building for centuries along the New Madrid seismic zone, stretching from northeastern Arkansas through southeastern Missouri into Tennessee and Kentucky, represents one of the most seismically active areas east of the Rocky Mountains. The earthquakes continued for months. Some were small tremors that rattled dishes. Others were major events that opened ground cracks, caused landslides, and temporarily changed the Mississippi's course. Eliza wrote about waking up morning after morning, never knowing whether the day would bring another major shock or just the constant background trembling that had become normal. Life took on a suspended quality. People moved through daily routines with constant awareness that the ground couldn't be trusted. They developed new habits, sleeping with shoes on, keeping emergency supplies at hand, paying attention to animal behavior that often seemed to sense major shocks before they hit. Between December 1811 and February 1812, the region experienced over 2,000 earthquakes. 3 were estimated magnitude 7.0 or higher, among the most powerful ever recorded in North America. The largest, on February 7, 1812, was so intense it temporarily reversed the Mississippi's flow, creating a waterfall where none had existed. Eliza's writings reveal someone trying to make sense of an experience that defied explanation. She described ground rolling like ocean waves, the horizon seeming to rise and fall, the disorienting experience of not being able to trust her own senses. She wrote about ground opening in long fissures that would sometimes close after a few hours, leaving only slight depressions. The psychological toll was immense. Eliza wrote about neighbors convinced the world was ending, others who developed nervous conditions that made them jump at every sound. Sleep became difficult, not just because of continuing aftershocks, but because of constant anxiety about when the next major event might occur. Perhaps most remarkably, life eventually returned to something resembling normalcy. The major earthquakes stopped, though minor tremors continued for years. People rebuilt homes, often incorporating lessons learned from the disaster. River traffic resumed, though pilots had to navigate around new sandbars and islands created by seismic activity. The New Madrid seismic zone is still there, still active, still building toward its next major event. Modern seismologists estimate that the probability of a major earthquake in the region over the next 50 years is higher than most people realize. When it comes, it will affect not the few thousand who lived there in 8 and 11, but the millions who now call the central Mississippi Valley home. Deep beneath the Arizona desert, in places no human has ever set foot, something extraordinary is happening. Rock formations stable for millions of years are beginning to shift, pulled apart by forces scientists are only beginning to understand. Dr. Rebecca Stolzman has spent 15 years studying what geologists call earth fissures, and she's convinced that what's happening in the American Southwest represents a fundamental landscape change that will reshape entire regions over coming decades. Her research has taken her to remote corners of Arizona, Utah, and Nevada, where she documents cracks that appear overnight and grow wider each year. What makes these fissures mysterious is that they don't follow usual earthquake patterns. They don't appear along known fault lines, and they're not associated with sudden, dramatic movement. Instead, they seem to result from something more subtle and persistent: the slow, inexorable settling of land as underground water supplies are depleted. Rebecca's work begins with satellite imagery, tracking fissure formation and growth across thousands of square miles. From space, these cracks look like hairline fractures in enormous pottery, running in straight lines for miles across seemingly unchanged terrain. But when she visits on foot, the scale becomes clear. Many fissures are deep enough that you can't see the bottom, and wide enough to pose genuine hazards. The science is complex, but the basic mechanism is straightforward. For decades, agricultural operations and growing cities have been pumping groundwater from deep aquifers much faster than natural processes can replenish it. As water levels drop, rock and sediment once supported by that water begin to compress and settle. In areas where geology is particularly fragile, this settling creates weakness zones that eventually open as visible surface cracks. What's particularly unsettling is how quietly this happens. Unlike earthquakes, which release energy in sudden, dramatic events, land subsidence is gradual, continuing for years or decades. Communities can experience significant ground-level changes without residents being aware until effects become impossible to ignore. Rebecca has documented cases where entire neighborhoods have settled several feet over a decade, with change happening so gradually that residents didn't notice until they began having foundation, driveway, and utility problems. Roads that were perfectly level when built have developed subtle but persistent grades that require vehicles to work harder to climb what used to be flat terrain. Understanding these changes requires combining traditional geology with cutting-edge technology. Rebecca uses GPS equipment that measures elevation changes down to the millimeter, tracking slow land settling over time. She employs ground-penetrating radar to map shifting underground structures, and seismic monitoring to detect subtle vibrations as rock formations adjust to new stresses. One of her most significant discoveries has been the interconnected nature of these geological changes. Fissures that appear isolated are often connected to underground movements happening miles away. She's documented cases where groundwater pumping in one location led to land subsidence and fissure formation 20 or 30 miles from the original pumping site. This interconnectedness has profound implications for land use and water management. Decisions made by farmers and developers in one region can have geological consequences that don't become apparent until years later, in locations that seem completely unrelated to the original activity. Perhaps most mysteriously, Rebecca has begun documenting accelerated zones, areas where change rates seem to be increasing without obvious explanation. These are places where fissures that have been slowly widening for years suddenly begin expanding much more rapidly, or where new cracks appear in clusters as if some threshold has been crossed, making ground more susceptible to fracturing. As Rebecca puts it, we're witnessing the landscape actively reshaping itself in real time. The changes we're seeing today will determine what the American Southwest looks like for our children and grandchildren. And in many cases, these changes are irreversible. Once the ground settles, once fissures open, there's no going back. Standing at the edge of one of these fissures on a quiet desert morning, watching sunrise over a landscape literally pulling itself apart, it's hard not to feel awe at the forces at work beneath our feet. The Earth, it turns out, is far more dynamic and responsive than most of us ever imagined. In the manicured suburbs of Scottsdale, Arizona, where million-dollar homes sit on carefully landscaped lots with desert mountain views, the geological changes transforming the Southwest take on a different character. Here, the same forces pulling apart rural desert are playing out against wealth, litigation, and the challenges of owning expensive property on unstable ground. Margaret Whitfield discovered the problem when her infinity pool began to crack. The house she and her husband built in the foothills north of Scottsdale was designed for dramatic desert views, with floor-to-ceiling windows and outdoor living spaces. The pool, which cost more than many entire homes, was the centerpiece of their backyard entertaining area. The first crack appeared as a hairline fracture along the pool's infinity edge. The maintenance company assured her it was normal settling, easily repaired. But within 6 months, the crack had widened to nearly an inch, and the pool's water level began dropping as water leaked into fractured ground beneath. What Margaret didn't know was that her property sat directly above one of the most active land subsidence zones in the Phoenix metropolitan area. The same groundwater depletion creating dramatic rural fissures was causing subtler but equally significant changes in developed areas, where deep wells and extensive irrigation had been drawing from underground aquifers for decades. The pool repair estimate was shocking, over $200,000 with no guarantee the problem wouldn't recur. The contractor explained that ground beneath the pool was continuing to settle, and any repair would need to account for ongoing movement. Margaret was being asked to pay for a potentially temporary repair on a problem that might worsen over time. Margaret's story is being repeated across affluent southwest suburbs, where expensive homes built on assumed stable ground are experiencing foundation problems, cracked driveways, and damaged pools and patios. The difference is that in these communities, problems are often hidden behind maintained landscaping and immediate repairs, making the issue's extent difficult to assess. The legal implications are complex and evolving. Homeowners sue builders, claiming properties were constructed on unstable ground without adequate disclosure. Builders sue geotechnical engineers, arguing soil studies failed to identify risks. Insurance companies deny claims, contending land subsidence falls under earth movement exclusions not covered by standard policies. In Scottsdale's most exclusive neighborhoods, property values are beginning to reflect these geological realities. Homes that might have sold for $2 million 5 years ago sit on the market for months, with buyers increasingly aware of potential foundation problems and ongoing ground movement. The response from wealthy communities has been characteristically different from rural areas. Rather than quiet adaptation, affluent suburbs are pursuing technological solutions, deep foundation systems, flexible utility connections, and landscaping designed to accommodate ground movement. Some homeowners spend hundreds of thousands on retrofits designed to make properties more resilient to ongoing geological changes. Private geotechnical consultants have found a lucrative niche, offering detailed soil studies and ongoing monitoring for individual properties. These studies can cost tens of thousands, but provide homeowners with detailed ground stability information, once available only to major construction projects. The contrast with rural communities is stark. While farmers adapt to earth fissures by changing land use practices, suburban homeowners are often willing to spend enormous sums to maintain the illusion of stability and control over their environment. Perhaps most tellingly, the issue has become a social status marker. Homeowners who can afford retrofits with latest geotechnical solutions maintain their lifestyles largely unchanged, while those who cannot are forced to accept ongoing property deterioration or sell and move to more stable areas. As we conclude this journey through America's hidden geological shifts, we're reminded that the ground beneath us is anything but still. What seems solid is part of a slow, powerful process shaping the land we live on. In quiet corners of the Southwest, sudden fissures and shifting soil reveal how dynamic and alive the earth truly is. These changes don't roar like earthquakes, they whisper, unfolding over years and decades. Yet their impact is no less real. They remind us that adaptation is part of life and that even the most stable ground is part of a vast, evolving system. Tonight, as you stand on this familiar ground, just take a moment to soak it all in. The earth is moving quietly, steadily crafting the future right beneath our feet. It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? We might not see it happening, but every little shift is shaping our world in ways we can't even imagine. So let's appreciate this moment and the incredible journey we're all on together.